Hi everyone. With this video, I wanted to discuss the upcoming sequel to Hollow Knight, Silksong. The trailer released a few days ago, and at the same time, though I wasn't made aware of it until now, the developers for the game, Team Cherry, released an interview where the two developers sit down and basically run down a list of facts about the upcoming games. And that's mainly what I wanted to talk about. Um, the trailer, I would love to sort of sit down and maybe do like a play-by-play of it and analyze it. But it seems like a lot of that kind of stuff Team Cherry covers in the interview. So what I did is I watched the interview and I made a list of the main talking points that they had in the video, and I wanted to just go down them one at a time and kind of talk about the game and sort of give my thoughts on it, because they have different concepts that they're trying to explore this time around. It's a different game, it's a sequel. Sequels tend to expand and change in terms of the story. Even if it's similar, the delivery is going to evolve. Stuff like that. So, first things first, I'm a really huge fan of Hollow Knight the game. When I was in Manchester, I wrote my thesis on Metroidvania more broadly, but the two primary texts that I analyzed were the 1986 Metroid, the first game in the series, and basically I worked my way up to Hollow Knight. So I saw Metroid as sort of the beginning, and then Hollow Knight was sort of the zenith, if you will, of Metroidvania up to that point. And this new game, I think, represents the next step in the continuing evolution of Metroidvania and Gothic video games. If there's anything Gothic about these games at all, how does it manifest in a Metroidvania? What is a Metroidvania? That's the kind of stuff that I tried to answer with my thesis, or at least begin to broach the subject, to treat it as something that you could ask questions about. Gothic academia has really only been performed in earnest since about the 1960s or 70s. Up until that point, it was seen kind of as a backwater, a curio, but not necessarily something to be taken seriously, almost pseudo-scholarship. But nowadays, it has evolved into something that's a little bit more nuanced or fleshed out, but video games are a little bit more new than that even. And Gothic scholars, while I've run into plenty who read novels or analyze cinema, I haven't met too many that see video games as Gothic. There's tends to be kind of a separation, if you will, with video games and Gothic media. And the term Gothic, really, it depends how you look at it and analyze it. And the reason I keep mentioning the word Gothic here is because I think that as Metroidvania, a game like Hollow Knight is a Gothic text. I don't want to see them as separate. I want to look at something like Metroidvania, which Hollow Knight is Metroidvania par excellence, and furthermore take that a step further and say that not only is it Metroidvania, but it's Gothic. And the point of this video is to look at the interview that Team Cherry gave a few days ago and think about, with Silksong being a sequel to Hollow Knight, can it still be Gothic or not? And I'm going to be thinking about these concepts as I go down this list and try and answer that basic question relative to each of those. If Hollow Knight was this and Silksong is this, do they still have common ground that they're trying to explore? And this is certainly true if you look at, say, the palimpsests of not just Metroidvania, but cinema that came before them. If you look at something like Alien, and then you look at something like Aliens, they're very similar in terms of what they are, but the way that they explore that sort of Gothic territory in terms of monsters and haunted houses. The first film is basically a guy with a knife chasing a woman through a haunted house. That's a fairly simple way of looking at it, but that's the gist. There's one killer, there's a small number of people that are trying to survive against a slasher villain. And in 1986, when Cameron did Aliens, where you have a large squad of well-armed Marines, and James Cameron is basically doing Zulu Dawn, but trying to make it scary, trying to make it tense. So there's horror themes, but there's a lot of action, and it's a very fast film. So that's the effect that it, being a sequel, had on the franchise. And it's pretty significant, and perhaps something similar could occur with Silksong. Okay, that's kind of where I'm coming from here. And without further ado here, let's kind of move into the talking points that Team Cherry examined. I started off kind of writing a blog post about this, and then I thought, all right, well, I have basically 2 paragraphs, and then it's just kind of talking points. For now, I'll just read the paragraph. There's an interview with the developers. According to them, the original game was about descending into the depths. And I thought this was really interesting because Hallownest in Hollow Knight was very subterranean. A lot of the areas were dark. There were ruins that you could descend into and get lost inside and experience a feeling that would border on madness. Is that thing dangerous? Is it not? Am I seeing things? So even though the bugs around you are actually going insane as a part of the didactic narrative, you as the player, as you're exploring the space, will experience a sensation that allows you to kind of approach that feeling of madness while you're underground. You can't actually play a video game and go crazy, I don't think, any more than you could read a book and go crazy. But you can feel emotions that cause you to feel confused or near something uncanny. That's a very common device in the Gothic, from novels to cinema to miniseries to video games, is to make you feel like you're constantly buried alive or surrounded by a feeling of danger and death and the past and ruins and so on and so forth. That's nothing new, but that was how Hollow Knight approached it. And in the sequel, the developers say that instead of descending into the depths, you're ascending the heights, you're climbing mountains. And if that's the case, is there still room for the Gothic? I would say yes, because Gothic stories involve large open spaces, especially early novels, say novels written in the late 1700s by someone like Anne Radcliffe. You would have these wide open expanses where even though it's a big open space, you're still isolated. And furthermore, there would be ruins peppering this territory. These dark forests with mist would have inside them a abbey or a monastery or a ruin or an old castle. In the Mysteries of Udolpho, for instance, Emily St. Aubert is captured and taken by Count Montoni to the castle of Udolpho, which is basically this run-down ruin of a castle in Italy that is helmed by him and his bandits. And it kind of reminds me of certain mythological stories where someone is captured and taken away. Persephone is taken by Hades to the underworld, and from there she's sort of trapped or kept prisoner. So that would be like a mythological archetypical story. This Gothic story, The Mysteries of Udolpho, isn't really that different. So even though Emily St. Aubert is sitting on this ship, she's perched on the prow of this vessel as it's cutting through the water, and she's looking at the castle, and it's getting closer, and it's sitting on a peninsula or like a rise of earth, and it's big, and it is surrounded by mist and darkness, and it is absolutely not underground, but there's still a feeling of claustrophobia, of being oppressed, because she's a prisoner, she's captive. So just because Silksong is about ascending the heights, I would say, well, as long as there's a sense of history, of danger, of the liminal, then absolutely there's plenty of room for the Gothic. It doesn't matter where you are. You could be on the moon or you could be in Nebraska. As long as there's certain conventions that you follow, the Gothic can be attained. Even if things are sort of colorful and cute, which it does seem like that there are things in the game that are colorful and cute, but there were things that were colorful and cute in Hollow Nest, the first game. You had Green Path, which was sort of this adorable green Brinstar area. It's the Brinstar of Hollow Nest, that first kind of area you get to after the newbie area. You get to the second area in the game. It's green and full of plant life, so that's a pretty common trope sequentially in Metroidvania, is to have an area like that in the game. And Hollow Nest actually had two, because you had the Queen's Gardens as well, and then of course you had the fungal wastes and other areas in that game that were sort of colorful. And here they're merely continuing that trend, and it seems like there's going to be more variety, kind of on par with Metroid Fusion, where Metroid Fusion you had all of the elements. I mean, there were elemental qualities to levels in Metroid, levels in Super Metroid. You had Norfair, which was this dark subterranean underground area filled with monsters and lava. And in Hollow Nest, I can't remember if there were any parts of the game that had lava. I want to say that there was at least one or two areas that had something equivalent to that. I know that they had electrified water and acid and spikes, but I don't remember if there was lava or not. But usually that's a pretty common device in platforming games. And Metroid had that. Metroid Prime had that. Metroid Prime, you had Fandara Drifts. In Metroid Fusion, you had the cold areas in the game that were so cold that you couldn't enter them. Or if you did enter them, there would be these indestructible X parasites that had adapted to the cold and things like that. And there was still a strong horror element in Metroid Fusion. And I think with Silksong, just like with Hollow Knight, even though there's variety and there's color and things like that, there's still room for horror. There's still room for the Gothic, because the Gothic isn't all about darkness and shadows. It's about having a presence of danger and darkness within a space. So you could have a house that has a bright, colorful garden, but as long as there's something dangerous about that and something old, then that's not a problem, I don't think. And even if everything is above ground, like Lovecraft's City of the Old Ones in At the Mountains of Madness, there were large portions of the Cyclopean city that, yes, it was kind of dark. They were in the shadow of a great Antarctic mountain. They were just kind of sitting there, and you had the explorers, the protagonist and Danforth, who were just walking around and kind of jotting down what they found in their journals, not unlike the Knight in Hollow Knight. Him, Samus Aran, characters from some of these Gothic novels. The female version of the Gothic from the 1700s, the woman lost in the castle, was a detective of sorts who had no power to fight back and had to use her wits to survive in a terrifying situation where she's kind of kept from exposing the monsters directly. Now, the palimpsest for Metroid was aliens and Alien, where in the first film and the second film, you basically had a rising evolutionary arc where Ripley got more and more weaponized until she's essentially turned into Rambo. But it's a hybrid form where you have Ripley in the beginning of Aliens, for instance, who is traumatized by the events that happened in the first film. And even then she was tougher than the rest of the Nostromo crew. But in Aliens, she starts off as kind of frail, and she evolves into a stronger version of herself until she can confront the monster. That narrative arc is something that's preserved through the ludic structure of Metroid and Hollow Knight, where you're walking through the space and you're taking notes and being a detective. And that kind of thing never really goes away until near the end of the game, when there's not a lot left to detect, and all that's really left for the player to do is to confront the monster, to confront the Radiance, to confront Mother Brain, to confront the Tyrant. Whichever survival horror kind of game, Metroid, Castlevania, it's all about confronting and surviving the horrifying and the terrifying in a Gothic situation. It's very much preserved and explored differently from game to game. Stuff like that, I think, is going to continue in Hallownest Silksong. The tempo of the game is going to be different. The look of the game is going to be somewhat different because, again, we go back to Aliens, the Gothic castle of the Nostromo in Ridley Scott's film is not quite the same thing as Cameron's version, just in terms of the architecture of the space is different. It's a human colony meant to colonize the moon or the planetoid, and it's an altogether different construct, but it unfolds in a fairly similar way. Even if it's the same protagonist, it's going to be an altogether different experience. And Hornet is not the same character that the Knight was in Hollow Knight. In Silksong, Hornet was an antagonist almost, or a demonic lover, right? Because there's two lovers that the Knight is chasing after. You have Bretta, who was that modest, shy sort of damsel in distress who has to be rescued, and Hornet was the exact opposite of that. And she's the one that you're chasing throughout most of the game. Bretta just kind of sits in town and doesn't really do anything. And what's interesting is that this time around you get to play Hornet, and that was something that was alluded to at the end of the Got Home. The Knight is kind of destroyed after defeating the Radiance, and then Hornet takes up the mantle, so to speak. And there's a little cutscene that kind of implies that she's not only saved at the end of the game. If you kill the Radiance at the end of Hollow Knight, Hornet is saved. But if you kill the improved version of the Radiance in Godhome, then Hornet is not only saved, but she has to fight back against whatever the hell this thing is that crawls out of Godhome after the Knight is destroyed. And it's interesting, though, in that in this game, Hornet's the playable character. But I'm not sure when the game is. The title is Hollow Knight, so I have to wonder, is she the new Knight? Because she's basically the replacement of the Knight. The Knight doesn't survive the process, but Hornet does, and after which she's forced to confront this dark threat that survives. Because ultimately, it's about a process of sacrifice to appease this old god, or this old kind of presence. Even in the lore of Hollow Knight, you have these arcane eggs, which imply that there's kind of a sedimentary history to Hallownest that you're only scratching the surface of. And it's one sequence after another of the same basic sacrificial sequence. If Hornet is next in that sequence, then is she the next Hollow Knight? And she has a mask, and furthermore, her mask resembles the knight that preceded the protagonist from Hollow Knight. If you go to the City of Tears and you see the statue of the defender of the city, it really resembles Hornet. And her mask is taller and bigger, but it's the same kind of idea. And if there's a connection there, then maybe she is the Knight. It's hard to say, though, again, because I'm not sure when the story takes place, because it could be before or after. The opening shot of the trailer for Silksong has her in a carriage, for instance. And I have to wonder if it's a prequel that's telling how she arrives at Hallownest, or it could be after she's captured while she's being chased and she's taken away to a faraway exotic land. A princess. captured by bandits and stolen away, spirited away to be a captive in a powerful castle. That's a pretty conventional way of framing a Gothic narrative. It's highly imaginative. It's not really in any particular location. It could be anywhere. In older stories, in these novels by, say, Anne Radcliffe's The Italian, the love interest, who also happens to be the protagonist of the story, one might argue, is captured by bandits. She can't fight back, and she's thrown into a carriage and spirited away by them over hostile territory. She didn't have the means to escape. Hornet does. Hornet can fight back, and it's hard to say though, because I don't know if she is a prisoner or not, or if she's being delivered there because she was a weapon of sorts, and maybe she's a mercenary. It's really hard to say based on what they've shown. It's kind of ambiguous, and I like that. There's room to speculate. Alright, so that's basically what I had so far in terms of my rough draft for my blog post. So, from here on out, I'm just going to go down the talking points, which are much briefer. I'll probably still kind of extrapolate on them a bit, but I don't have as much written out in front of me. This is a sequel, right? So, Silksong is the sequel, or the prequel to Hollow Knight. Chronologically, it comes after it, even if the story takes place before. It doesn't really matter. The point being is that the pace of the game is going to be different. Team Cherry says in their interview that it's built on the Hollow Knight model, but it has new environments. They're not going to be radically different in terms of a Metroidvania structure, but they're still new. That's the beauty of a Metroidvania, is even if it's the same kind of formula, each Metroidvania, if done well, will feel new and unique. You have Dead Cells, you have Hollow Knight, you have Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, and all the Game Boy Advance handheld games, Metroid, you have Dark Souls, you have the Bloodborne games, any of those. They're all going to feel unique, even if they're really kind of riffing off or borrowing from each other quite liberally. Furthermore, in Silksong, developers say that there's a lot that isn't shown. Right off the bat, when I was told that, I started imagining things. They show us a little bit of the green, beautiful environments. There's like this coral red and this sea blue kind of space. It almost looks like a grotto in some type of lagoon. And I saw things like that and had to wonder, okay, is there going to be more stuff like that? Or is there going to be graveyards and temples? And I feel like any game developer is going to, with a sequel, try and expand on things and move away from the familiar territories that they explored in the first game, because they may not have been wholly familiar in the first game, but if they just regurgitated them in the sequel, it's going to feel somewhat rote. I have to wonder what Silksong is going to do as far as all of that goes, because if you look at Doom Eternal, for instance, you're not just on Mars, right? You're going to Earth, but you're also going to this weird demonic kind of sanctuary where things almost take on a Geiger-esque or cybernetic quality. If they have that kind of variety in that, and things are just bigger and better, based on what I've seen in the trailer for Silksong, I am just imagining more of what we see. But then there may be things that they don't show in the trailer. They don't want to just tip their hand and show everything. They actually show quite a bit. I was really surprised by the sheer number of things. But you also have to keep in mind, this is a full game. They do have more to show. This isn't just downloadable content. So even if it seems like they showed a lot, there's a potential that if this is a bigger Venus Twin Kingdom to Hollow Knight, which was a very large Metroidvania, if you compare it to Super Metroid or Metroid, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, it's actually quite a bit bigger than most of those games, especially in terms of the different directions you can go. You can branch out fairly early on. Unless you're being somewhat unconventional in your playstyle, you have to go to Green Path. But then after that, and you get to the fungal wastes, On the City of Tears, you can really branch out and go to different areas. If this is a bigger, crazier game, it may seem like they showed a lot, but they could have just showed us the tip of the iceberg here, and that's really exciting because perhaps there's something contained within the levels of the game that isn't anything like what we saw in Hollow Nest. Now, I would be kind of surprised because, again, the variety in Hollow Nest and the first Hollow Knight was very eclectic, because you had Green Path, you had the Ancient Basin, you had the Abyss, you had the Coliseum of Fools and the area that it was attached to. You had the Hive, which they upgraded with the DLC and made it look even better and cooler. If Silksong is bigger and crazier than Hollow Nest, they've showed us things that do look distinct and different from Hollow Nest, but they've also showed us quite a few things that look pretty much in the same vein, if you will. It's cut from the same cloth, obviously. I think there's certainly room for improvement, though. So I'm excited about that. And again, they mentioned that it's not DLC, it's a full game. They're not tacking it on. It's more of a sequel, again, in line with, say, Doom to Doom Eternal. It feels very much like a sister title to the first game, but it is its own game with its own world. One thing that's different, they said, is it's a faster pace and tempo. So even if you have a Gothic sort of world, right, that explores things that are terrifying and horrifying monsters in the way that they're presented in-game in a Gothic sort of space, the tempo can be slow or fast. And I think with a game like Hollow Knight, it was pretty consistent, but it did seem like there were moments where you're just kind of exploring and walking through and looking around, especially once you get to the White Palace and it turns into Super Meat Boy. There are still moments where there's not a lot of fighting going on, or there's less. And then there are moments where you fight the Manus Lords or the Sleeper's Guardians in the City of Tears. You have moments like that where there are bursts of combat. But all in all, it's kind of paced to be somewhat slow. You have combat somewhat slow. If you look at Dead Space, it's the same way, where there's more of a feeling of walking through a space and experiencing the affect of it, the sense of danger, as opposed to just being in combat nonstop. And then in Dead Space 2, there's more combat, the weapons are upgraded, there's more replayability in terms of fighting the menace in the space. And I have to wonder if Silksong will be like that, if it has a faster pace and tempo. The combat certainly does look different, and it seems like the character Hornet is a bit different than the Knight. The crafting system is present, and it reminds me of games like Alien Isolation or Dark Souls. In Dark Souls, you had the blacksmith, I think, and you would collect souls and use them as currency to upgrade your armor and weapons and whatnot. In Alien Isolation, it was literally a crafting system where you would jury-rig your equipment to survive in Sevastopol while you were being chased by the Xenomorph. And that notion of gathering ingredients and jury-rigging homemade weapons to try and stay alive, which would require a keen eye and also a keen mind to be able to do, while hiding and sort of sticking to the shadows. But in this game, Silksong, it seems like, even though there's a crafting system, it's a game that has a great deal of combat. And it did seem like, watching the footage for the trailer, that the abilities that Hornet has are actually fairly nuanced. You could switch them out, and they have some pretty unique functions. So it's not just the same old fireball, but it hits harder. It's not quite the charm system, it's a crafting system. So I have to wonder if she gets ammunition or crafting ingredients, if she can make permanent sort of charms, or if she has temporary weapons that are strong but have limited uses, which I think would be really interesting. I like that idea. As much as I enjoy Metroid, where you have permanent upgrades, Super Metroid in particular I really loved because you could toggle them on and off. But what if, instead of being able to toggle them on and off, you could have limited uses, like missiles, but instead of missiles, it would be high jump or something like that, where you only had a certain number of jumps. That's a pretty cool and fun system, especially with survival horror. You want to have limited health, you want to have limited ingredients, you want to feel as though you're disempowered by the space because it has a punitive quality. It's taxing in ways that are draconian, that cause you to feel as though you're at your limit and you're running on fumes. A crafting system with a limited number of ingredients would be a great way to encroach upon that sort of feeling, especially in a Gothic space where what better way to feel as though you're in danger when you're isolated and you're low on health? Well, what if you need your crafting system and your crafting items to be able to make it through a really tough fight, but you don't have enough of a particular ingredient and you can't necessarily backtrack because it might not be worth it. The logistics of that would be impractical. So I'm imagining things like that, but in kind of a Hollow Knight kind of way, in terms of jumping around and moving through the space. That's a key element in Metroidvania is movement and platforming and unlocking doors and boss keys and things like that. Solving puzzles through motion and combat and finding items that allow you to sort of navigate. They mentioned sequence breaks. What if you collect certain items, it could allow you to do a sequence break that you otherwise couldn't do, but they're temporary, which almost has a quality like Simon's Quest or Castlevania 2, where if you collected certain items, you would progress the narrative. Well, in this, what if it wasn't mandatory, but it's something you could do to progress through the game in a Metroidvania sense, similar to bomb jumping or freezing a enemy standing on them, the Rippers from Metroid. You would freeze them and stand on them and use them as platforms. And a lot of those were put in the game that you could use. Well, that is kind of a device that you use according to power-ups that you find. But what if they had similar devices that you could use according to the crafting system? Sequence breaks with a crafting system with limited uses, and that could throw in all kinds of replayability that doesn't really exist in Hollow Knight. And that game has a fair amount of flexibility when it comes to, okay, you're going to go this way or that way. The developers clearly had sequence breaks in mind. It's not very linear at all. That would defeat the whole point of a Metroidvania. You're free to kind of move in any direction you want. There are limits, and what those limits are really depends on the title, but perhaps with this, the crafting system could allow those limits to be different and much more numerous. The movement ceiling would be much higher in terms of the number of ways that you could explore the space. I think that would be really cool. Furthermore, there's a quest system. Team Cherry describes Hornet as a fulfiller of wishes. There'll be quest characters and quest logs. So it seems like in the trailer they describe it as being full of monsters, but also new friends. There are more people that are alive, and there were people that were alive in the first game. You had Dirtmouth, Bretta, and Zote. I didn't really like Zote. That was fun to kind of let him die or beat him up in the Coliseum. You had characters like that, and there was the miner at Crystal Mountain. She would kind of change over time until she was possessed. I liked things like that, but it sounds like with this, you'll have characters that you can actually interact with on a face-to-face basis, so again, kind of like Simon's Quest or certain Metroid titles. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes had characters that you could talk to, ghosts, whereas in some of the older titles, you would just find the Chozo statues. They were dead or they were inanimate, usually. Sometimes they would come alive. But you couldn't have conversations with them quite the same way that you could a character that actually had dialogue. So it sounds like that's going to be something that's in this game, and it sounds kind of cool. I know some people didn't really like this change, but in Metroid Fusion, you had the computer that you would have to talk to constantly, and he would tell you where to go. I liked it because there was kind of a story that developed between you and Adam, And at first, Samus names the computer after Adam, but it turns out that it actually is Adam. It's his consciousness, and it's been put in the computer. Like, it seemed like it was kind of new to Metroid, but the game still felt like a Metroid game. I felt like it was, it took away a lot of things that I identify with as the Metroid experience in terms of being able to go in any direction that you want. Exploration in that game is basically denied to the player until the very end. And it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case with Silksong, but you're having new devices and elements, and it makes sense, right? Because it's a new character, it's a new kingdom. So why wouldn't there be some variation? It's evolving and changing into something new. Apart from the new character, the new world, you also have new foes. Now, in the trailer, I think it's at 180 monsters, give or take. In the interview, Team Cherry said 150 or so versus Hollow Knight's 140. Now, of course, the game's not even finished yet, and they said it's not really nearing crunch time at this point, so I'm not sure. They probably have an idea of when crunch time is, but they could keep adding. It sounds like it's bigger, and I don't want to say better. I don't like the term bigger and better, but it's definitely bigger. It's more expansive. It's more populated. Sequelitis, right? Bigger monsters, or more of them. Cameron with his army of xenomorph warriors and the alien queen. I would not be surprised if the number went from 150 to 180 to maybe 200 plus. That's not including quest characters that you can interact with. That's good, that's great. And it makes sense too, because it's a different hero, a hero whose capabilities are different than the Knights, but feels similar enough that you can call it a Hollow Knight title. One thing that Team Cherry said they wanted to avoid were recolors. That was one thing that I really disliked about Super Metroid, for instance, were that a lot of the enemies in the game were simply recolors. Now, there is one exception to that, and that's the Golden Space Pirates, namely the two that you have to duel before you fight Ridley and Lower Norfair. It's a pretty iconic fight. They weren't simply recolors, though. They would be gold when they were invincible, and there were so many different things about them that made them very unique in terms of them somersaulting through the air, doing dive bomb kicks. They would only turn gold when they became invincible, but they were actually very nuanced enemies, and there were two of them, and you had to fight them at the same time, and they were kind of a mini boss, if you will, a penultimate boss fight to Ridley. And I thought that was really cool, so that's not really a reskin, but there were plenty of other space pirates in the game that were green, red. They just change colors, and they give them more health. I didn't really like that. Whereas in Metroid Fusion, you had bosses that wouldn't just change color when you damaged them. So if you fought Kraid in Super Metroid, he would just change color, and then that was it. He would die and the fight was over. But he was fairly static throughout the fight. Whereas if you fought him in Zero Mission, his attacks would change as he got redder and redder. He would shoot these spikes that would destroy the platforms that you were standing on, and then you would have to sort of climb up those and avoid them while standing on them and try and hit his weak point to kill him. And in Metroid Fusion, if you fought certain bosses, you would blast pieces off of them, and they would change as the fight progressed in ways that were very visual. It was very visually creative. The security robot, you would blast pieces off of the robot, and it would evolve and change. And the more you damaged it, you would blast up parts of its chassis until you could see that it had this like biomechanical brain inside of it that controlled it, that eventually got infected. I thought that was a really cool idea. The Nightmare, it's the same kind of idea. It's like this huge bioweapon. And of course, the station in that game, it was a research station, but there's this weaponized, perfidious element that they're keeping secret, the weapons division, if you will, just like in Alien, something like that, where it's a science facility run by a company that has weaponized interests that it keeps secret. It doesn't have a big sign saying weapon research. It just says science research, but it's weaponized science. It's Promethean science. But during these boss fights, they would unfold in ways that were really cool. Like, again, the nightmare, when you would fight it, like it was a tiered fight. And first you had to damage his gravity generating machine, and then you would have to shoot his face until its face like melted off, and then it would turn into the core X that you would defeat, and then you could get the power up. Like, it's just visually amazing. And if Hollow Knight is avoiding recolors, I have to imagine that they'll have fights like that that are tiered. Now, I'm trying to remember if there were any fights that were tiered like that in the first Hollow Knight. You had the False Knight. It seems like you had the dream battles, which were a little bit different, and it was kind of interesting, right? Because you had that extra dimensional fight that would occur where the boss was different. Regardless of which version of the boss you were fighting, either in Hollow Nest or in the dream world, it seemed like the boss was fairly static. You had the lost kin, the same kind of idea. It just had a set amount of patterns, and the boss didn't get faster or didn't change shape while you were fighting it. The Radiance was definitely a tiered fight. It's a longer fight. And I know in God Home you have certain fights that progress and evolve and change. Then of course you have Troopmaster Grimm, who is very difficult and very fast, but again, it's just a set sequence of attacks, and once you memorize it, you can kind of just, it doesn't really change. You know, once his health gets lower, he doesn't do what Dracula does in Castlevania, where he starts off as the Count, right? And then he turns into this big sort of hopping demon monster. There wasn't really a lot of that in Hollow Knight, or it's not really leaping to mind. You fight the Traitor Lord, I believe it was, in the Queen's Garden. It's the same kind of idea. You have some minions that you squash before you fight him, and then if you rescued Cloth at that point, she'll come and help you out. But then it's just the same fight from beginning to end. And I have to wonder if they'll kind of expand on that. And it does seem like they have some pretty big, ambitious bosses. There's this one that's like the size of the entire screen. It's like this huge giant, and she's surrounded by lava. Hornet is, while she's fighting it in Silksong. That looks cool. So it does seem like they'll be doing that. And it'll still be kind of a scary game, but exciting too, in ways that make it really memorable. You're going to want to go back and experience that, I think. The composer is returning this time around, and Team Cherry said in regards to that, he's been working with them since the idea of Silksong was a thing. In their interview, they say it's a world linked with song and music. Silksong, and I thought immediately when I heard that, Silk Roads, the Gothic can sort of combine different elements into a highly imaginative hybrid narrative. So it's liminal, but it's also hybrid. And that was one thing that Horace Walpole did with the Castle of Otranto, is he took the modern novel and injected with it elements of the ancient romance. A romance meaning containing elements of high imagination, stories of high adventure, if you will. But there are notions of the past castle full of ghosts and murderers and knights and monsters. Look at Castlevania to have a pretty good idea of a video game emulation of that. Dark Souls, same idea. And with this, you have Silksong and the Silk Roads, an Orient setting, if you will, or the Middle East, the Silk Roads of history in our world, that are kind of swept into a sort of a tale from 1001 Arabian Nights, a world ruled by silk and song, silk trade, a princess captured by exotic bandits and stolen away into a distant land, a powerful castle. It's not that crazy of a deviation. It's in the same kind of imaginative world that the Gothic inhabits. So I think that's pretty cool. As far as the music goes, I really did like the composer to Hollow Knight. There were certain tracks that were pretty catchy. By and large, it was kind of atmospheric. It wasn't what I would call Castlevania music, where it's just kind of rousing and it's really memorable, almost kind of rocking. Even if you get to something like Symphony of the Night, where you have a lot of variation to the tracks, Festival of Servants, Tragic Prince, these are rockin' songs. And I have to wonder if they're going to experiment and try that kind of Castlevania approach, or if they're going to do what Metroid does. Obviously, the first Metroid game has a lot of really memorable tracks. Brinstar, in particular, that kind of upbeat sort of approach at the beginning of the game, and then Surface Runner from Metroid 2. Barring one or two tracks in Super Metroid, it was largely sort of subdued, whereas Castlevania is much more energetic and exciting by and large. That's not to say that they don't have atmospheric tracks, but Castlevania is largely remembered music-wise for its energy and its memorability, and that's not saying that Metroid's tracks aren't memorable too, but they tend to be a little bit subdued, especially if you look at Metroid Fusion, Zero Mission, Super Metroid, all of them, the music is more atmospheric, more in the background to kind of make you feel a particular way. And I think Hollow Knight was largely that way too. Apart from one or two tracks, I think. It wasn't melodically uninteresting, but it also wasn't just demanding that you listen to it while you're playing the game. You were invested as much in exploring the space and just trying to make it through in one piece than you were to just kind of tap your foot to the music or headbang. So I have to wonder what the music will be like this time around, and if they're experimenting with everything else a little bit and introducing new elements, maybe Hornet, her music will be a little bit more feisty than the Knights, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But given the quality of the music that he produced for Hollow Knight, I think whatever he produces, if it's more of the same or something a little bit more experimental, I think we'll be in good hands as far as all of that goes. And then last but not least, the game will be launching on console as well as PC, and I think that's really important because I got Metroid, the original Metroid, Super Metroid that is. I didn't play Metroid until college. Maybe I played it once or twice at a friend's house, but I remember getting Super Metroid when it released in 1994 on the Super Nintendo. And at that point I had had the SNES for a few years, and then that came out and I got it for my birthday. Because I have a twin, an identical twin, so he and I each got a game. I think I got Clay Fighter and he got Super Metroid, but it didn't matter. We played the shit out of both of those. And I think it's really important that they have a console launch with Nintendo, and they're really supporting them with that. And now it's the Switch, right? And it's this awesomely powerful handheld device compared to the Game Boy that I had growing up as a kid, which took 4 AA batteries, and you couldn't plug it into a wall charger. It didn't have a light-up screen. There's just so many things that it didn't have compared to the Switch. I mean, the Switch is just, it sounds like a beautiful thing, and eventually I want to get one. And point of fact, one of my supervisors when I was at MMU in Manchester writing my thesis had a Switch and was playing Hollow Knight on it to do research, right? That's one nice thing about being an academic scholar studying video games, is your research is comprised partially of exploring the primary texts, which in this case is playing video games. So, I mean, that's pretty awesome. Now, I spend a lot of time reading scholarship and stuff like that, which is primarily the written word. And the articles that I produce are written. But in any case, yeah, it's really important to have a console or a physical sort of platform that you can introduce your game on, especially a canonical one. You know, it's not like third party or anything weird like that. I think it's great that Hollow Knight has that with Nintendo, and that, you know, they have a release. Now, I think with the Switch, it's not physical. The Switch device itself is physical, but you still download the game digitally and you play it on the Switch. I know that Team Cherry had plans to do a physical release for the game with a box and box art, and they had a company that wanted to help them with that. But it seems like, well, okay, it's just 3 guys, right? It's the 2 developers for the game, and then it's the composer, the music composer. So basically the development team is 3 guys, which I think is completely mind-blowing considering this game is shaping up to be even bigger than Hollow Knight, which was bigger and crazier than Super Metroid. Now, that's not to say that Super Metroid isn't a great Metroidvania, and the size of the world doesn't really matter as long as you enable the character to be able to move through it however they want, depending on what items they collect. I mean, people are still speedrunning and playing Super Metroid years after the fact, owing largely to the way the game is designed. Like, there's so many different ways that you can sequence break the game, and some of it perhaps isn't intentional, and there's bugs that you can exploit, but a lot of it is, like bomb jump and wall jump and damage boost and shine spark and things like that. There's so many different things that the developer's doing there to enable Samus to be able to move through the space however she wants. And yeah, there's a narrative of action and story that unfolds, but you can do reverse boss order in Super Metroid, which I didn't think was possible. It's difficult, but it is doable, and you're not, if I remember correctly, though I could be wrong about this, there aren't too many bugs that you're exploiting. You can skip bosses in that game. With a game like that, it's really impressive, and it had, I guess by today's standards, a somewhat smaller development team, but it was still bigger than Team Cherry, which is 2 guys and a composer. The game itself that we're playing, if it didn't have any music, would just be made by 2 guys. On one hand, it's crazy in terms of what they're able to put out, but it also allows them to preserve the vision that they want. It's clearly a labor of love, and I just have the utmost sort of love and respect for these guys, for the work that they do. I wouldn't have written my thesis if it weren't for them. Or if I had, it would have been on something else. By the time I started playing Hollow Knight, I largely played it overseas. I think I had played it once or twice before going to England and Manchester, but when I was overseas, I was still able to play the game, and I decided, okay, what am I going to write my thesis about? And I decided, why not? You know, it's the ultimate Metroidvania, or it's the current state of what I consider to be top shelf Metroidvania. And that's not to say that they're the only gig in town, but I think they have a very pure, honest version of what Metroidvania is. You know, it's a genre that you don't really see a lot in mainstream in terms of 2D side scrollers like Castlevania or Metroid. Those aren't really getting made right now. Metroid, Prime 4, Retro Studios got hired to pick up the development for that game again. That game got delayed like crazy, and only now are they just picking it back up. It's going to be 3D. I bet my top dollar on that. As far as like classic sort of Metroid or classic Castlevania, you don't really see that. And the kinds of games that really kind of emulate the style that Hollow Knight is representing is basically an indie sort of category, even though Team Cherry is really successful in terms of Hollow Knight and Kickstarter, and they're just really just giving it their all, and they're just producing this amazing content. I would consider them independent. You know, they're just 3 guys working together on this full time, mind you. I'm sure it's a phenomenal amount of work, but they're not a AAA company, and I think that's a good thing, because some of the best games ever made had tiny development teams. Like, you look at the old Blizzard before Activision, you know, bought them, and Blizzard Activision now as a AAA company isn't anything like the Blizzard that I grew up with. And I prefer the games that they made before they sort of struck gold. And with Team Cherry, it seems like they're just like hitting their stride, man. And Hollow Knight was an awesome game. I absolutely loved it. But I think this is going to be just as good, if not better. And don't get me wrong, I like games where there's less. As far as Metroid, the original Metroid, I played that game. I beat that game, though I had to have a guide. I cheated with that, I guess. But I did beat it. I played Metroid 2. I never beat it. But those games still have something to offer. But it doesn't mean that I don't encourage the franchise to grow and evolve. With titles like Zero Mission and Metroid Fusion and the Metroid Prime games, up to a point, I think they were really awesome. And Zero Mission, I liked returning to Planet Zebes and learning Samus's backstory through a retelling of Metroid. I thought that was a great idea. I liked the Adam storyline in Metroid Fusion. In Metroid Prime 3 and in Metroid Other M, they start to introduce more and more characters to the point that it feels a little bit too crowded. And I hope that Silksong doesn't make that mistake where you just have way too many quest characters. And that's the thing, you know, if they do a Dark Souls or something like that, where you have a lot of like quest characters, but they're always in the periphery and they're not like tagging along. This isn't Sonic, okay? It's not Sonic and Tails, as long as you don't have like an annoying sidekick. Now you could have a familiar like Alucard in Symphony of the Night, you know, something like that. Okay, sure. But you had stuff like that in Hollow Knight with the knight and his charms, where you had like the little grubs and the spiders and things like that. I don't mind having a pet, but having like a side character who follows you around and is kind of annoying. Tim Cherry really seems to understand Metroidvania. I'm not really worried about that. That essentially concludes what they discuss in the interview itself. They did have a portion at the end where they go over some Kickstarter ideas, their Kickstarter campaign. They didn't really discuss the game any further, though. They also didn't mention a release date for the game. I have to wonder when the game will come out. I don't think it'll come out this year, and I wanted to sort of maybe elaborate on that really quick. The first game was announced November 2014, but it wasn't released until February 2017, so 2.5 years later, give or take. It took a while for it to release, though I imagine that a fair amount of that development time was them building the game up from nothing. They started out with more of an idea, and then they had to build the game in its entirety. Whereas by the time they announced Silksong, they already have the engine of the game to work with, and they have the kingdom of Hollow Nest that they can model the kingdom of Silksong after. So I imagine that will expedite things as far as all of that goes. I know that they're trying to make the game bigger, and they're trying to experiment, but the experiments are more of minor deviations away from the original game. It's not something completely new. I do think that even though it will speed things up, it does sound like they're trying to be a little bit more ambitious in terms of, all right, we're going to make this a big world, perhaps an even bigger world in terms of the levels and the characters, and we're going to introduce concepts that didn't exist in Hollow Knight that will allow you to play the game in different ways. There isn't going to be just a hardcore mode, steel mode, where if you lose all of your health and you die, then the game is over. It sounds like they're going to try different things. I imagine that will take a certain amount of time, but I can't imagine that that would take more time than starting from scratch, which they don't have to do this time around. I imagine that they'll get a certain amount of content ready and assembled, enough to basically allow the player to play the game in a mostly finished state, and they'll release that. And then following that, they'll have DLC. Now, I know that with the DLC for Hollow Knight, that was all planned. The first three, I believe, Hidden Dreams, The Grim Troop, and Lifeblood, and those were basically announced 6 months apart, and then you had maybe 2 or 3 months to sort of release them after they were announced. That was all planned, and they seem to be quite structured in how they release things. So if I had to sort of predict when this game will be released, it will probably be sometime in mid to late 2020, and when it does get released, they will release it, and then they'll have sort of staggered release dates for planned DLC for the game, because they're going to want to get the main game out, and then they'll just sort of polish it and sort of build on it the way that they did with Hollow Knight. So that's pretty exciting, and I definitely look forward to hearing more about the game, and if there are any sort of announcement dates or future interviews or content that gets floated by Team Cherry, then I will certainly cover that as it develops. So yeah, pretty exciting stuff. If you guys like the video, like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications for when I release new content. And before I go, I just wanted to say or provide a brief update in regards to my blog and the other content that I produce. I've had a little bit more time to sort of think about that now that my deadline is nearly here for the journal article that I'm writing for the Irish Gothic Journal. That's nearly finished. I do have some other conferences that I want to attend and abstracts to write and so on and so forth. Plenty of ideas, but in regards to my blog and my YouTube channel, I wanted to steer those in more of a Gothic direction. It's my area of expertise. I went to grad school to study the Gothic, and I want to talk more about Metroidvania. It's what I wrote my thesis on, and it's ultimately what I want to write my PhD on. Either Metroidvania or Gothic video games that have something to do with Metroidvania. So I would like to be able to sort of discuss some of these ideas on my blog and on my YouTube channel, instead of just writing about any kind of movie, even horror movies. I would like to start analyzing them a bit more gothically, and even movies that aren't necessarily what you would label as gothic or horror. I would like to try and analyze through that particular lens as well. So that's something you can expect to see from me in the near future. I'm a little bit more excited to produce content about that kind of thing, given that it's what I research and what I spend most of my time thinking about. So I will certainly let you know when there's new content to be had or viewed. You can either find it on here or on my blog. And if I manage to get any of my academic stuff published, I will post an announcement about that as well. Until then, guys, thanks for watching and take care.